And we're live. Hi everyone, hope you're having a great evening. With me today is Professor Emanuel Buttigieg from the University of Malta. So let's just say a quick hi to everyone in the chat and we can start talking on today's subject. Hi Charlene, hi Lisa, good to see you, and hi Cross, hope you're all doing great. So Professor, I understand that you've had a very busy year, yeah?
Hello, Carl. Good evening to you and your followers. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. Yes. Late June, early July, we're at the end of the academic year. It's been a very busy, intensive one, and more colorful than usual because of COVID, of course. We had to adapt to a very different reality, but somehow we made it through. And I'm glad we're nearly at the end of it. I apologize if my voice at times might sound a bit croaky, but that always happens at this time of the year because I would have been talking a lot in the previous months, and now with air conditioning and the heat and everything, it always happens.
Yeah, and I'm afraid we're going to keep you talking for quite a bit today.
I'll do my best.
I understand you've also got a new diploma course starting this October.
Yes. May I share my screen for a moment, Carl?
Oh, please do. Second.
Okay. This is the poster for the Diploma in Maltese History in Context. This is a program that we started 2 years ago, in fact, Carl. So this will be the second time that it will be running. And this is a program that is really intended for anyone who is interested in Maltese history. Probably they didn't have the chance to study it earlier in their lives. Going by experience, when we opened it last year, we were able to attract a nice range of people. Anyone who was sort of in their 30s, 40s, is working and wanted to do something in the evening, because this is a part-time evening course on the subject, to others who are slightly more mature in their years and have a bit more time and therefore wanted to do this also as a way of, in a way, socializing and meeting people, which is also important. And what we do is that over this stretch of 2 years, we start from the very beginning in prehistory and go all the way to contemporary times. And we also cover a number of thematic subjects like war, the Navy, minorities, women, geography, and so on. So that by the end of it, we hope to give something very holistic and interesting to those that are interested in the subject. The course is done in person. Usually it's about 3 times a week between October and May in the evening, so always after 5 p.m. And if anyone's interested in learning a bit more about it, I would suggest that they visit the Facebook page of the department, History at UM. It's the pinned post, so it's the very first one they will see, and there's all the information. Or they can feel free to contact me via email, and I'll be happy to provide more information. The deadline is the 21st of July to apply. It's possible to apply after that, but the application fee is slightly higher. So early birds always get the best deals. I would love to see a number of your followers joining us as well, if they're interested.
Okay.
Stop sharing that.
Okay.
Thank you for allowing me to speak about it.
No, absolutely. Just remember that it's an in-person course. So if anyone is watching from Malta, they're definitely it's definitely recommended. Anyone who is out of Malta, maybe we can just keep asking the university to provide it online, yeah?
Or move over for 2 years, why not?
Yeah, they could do that, I guess. So, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself before we start on our subject of today?
Sure, with pleasure. So my name is Emanuel Buttigieg. I am an associate professor in early modern history at the University of Malta. My main area of interest are the Knights of Malta, hence the subject of today. Broadly speaking, from the late 16th century to the 18th centuries, which in the case of the Knights coincides with their time in Malta. But I'm also interested in what we call global history, especially because this is the time when Europe is expanding outside of Europe and many other cultures are coming into contact with Europeans. I did my PhD at the University of Cambridge quite a while ago now. And I looked at the knights from the point of view of nobility, religion, and gender. So I was interested to see what it meant to be a man, essentially, in a military religious organization, which is what the knights were, and to an extent still are. And since then, I've also developed an interest in rituals and public festivities. The order was a great sponsor of such events. And at the moment, I'm also very interested in war. And I'm working on a book on the military and naval activities of the knights in the 17th century, which was a bit of a golden age for their navy and their military wing. They were involved in a number of wars and engagements all over the Mediterranean. And I hope that book will come out sometime next year. Fingers crossed.
Well, I will.
If I manage working out on it, and maybe we can talk about it at that point.
I will definitely be looking out for that, and once you publish it, I would be happy to have you over again to discuss that.
Thank you.
Now, with regards to our subject of today, magic and violence and healing in the context of the Hospitallary Knights, how do you define magic in this context?
Mm-hmm. So these are thoughts that come out of my PhD originally, which then became a book, and on which I teach and still think about. May I just share my screen again for a moment, Carl?
Okay,
I think that would help.
Hold on a second. So just a reminder to everyone in the chat, if you want to drop any questions or ask questions, please leave them in chat and we'll bring them up as soon as possible.
So you asked me about the definition of magic. There's a number of ways that one can think about it. It involves usually some kind of ritual, that is some kind of procedure, through which one is trying to tap into the powers of the supernatural. From a Christian point of view, and remember, we're talking of the 16th to 18th century, so of course Christianity is the main frame of reference for most people, including the knights. From a Christian point of view, magic is viewed suspiciously because when we're saying that it tries to tap into the supernatural, very often that means that it's also trying to tap into demonical powers, that there is some kind of pact with the devil that is involved, the devil or evil spirits. So magic and witchcraft are generally viewed suspiciously by the authorities, and that's not just the knights, but that's across Europe. At the same time, it is very obvious that people from all kinds of social backgrounds, all kinds of genders, are interested in it and appreciate that it is a means through which they can meet the challenges of life. And this is something that I always try to explain to my own students, because very often from our own point of view of today, we might be dismissive of it as superstitious, as ignorant. In reality, I generally find that it was a very rational exercise. That people, knights included, face certain challenges, challenges of love, challenges of war, challenges of survival. And within the very limited means that they had, because of course their technology was not what we have. But within their very limited means, magic and witchcraft often offered a way in which to try to meet those challenges. Now, it didn't always work. Perhaps it never worked, but they might have believed that it did. And so I find that it's actually often a very intelligent way of trying to make sense of the challenges that one meets. You see here the other term, maleficium. And that's very interesting. So maleficium meant harmful magic. And that's what people and the authorities were mostly worried about. That there were certain individuals, witches, who would use maleficium to cause harm to other individuals, but sometimes to whole communities. And the worry there is that the presence of these witches could draw the anger of God upon that community. And therefore, that is why communities tended to be on the lookout for these kinds of individuals, because they couldn't just let them be, because the consequences for everyone could be very, very serious.
Excuse me, Professor. When you say that that's what the authorities were mostly concerned about, does that mean that, for example, I don't know, someone who was mainly known for healing or for, I don't know, raising animals or whatever with magic was not bothered by the authorities, or did they still look into that?
As ever, a lot depends on context.
Right.
So most of the time when the going is good, as they say, the wise old woman or the wise old man, these tended to be your stereotypical figures who have a knowledge of herbal remedies, who practice some kind of healing practices, people to whom members of the community would go, nights included, for a range of solutions, and we can talk about these a bit later. Most of the time that is tolerated, at least. However, then when you get circumstances like a drought, a plague, the threat of war or actual war, situations where livestock or young children seem to get sick and die very mysteriously. Again, they have a limited range of explanations, no? That's where the community and the authorities might zoom in onto these individuals that usually might be, at the very minimum, tolerated, if not actually integrated in the community. So it really depends on the situation. A witch, we might think of the witch as a female, usually as an old female, but in reality, it's a term that was applied to both men and women. And you're going to find both female and male witches. The wizard, on the other hand, was something of a wise man, a practitioner of magic. So it's a slightly different category. It usually is limited to men of a certain education as well. Whereas witches, again, it covers a much more broader range of people, some of which might be very well educated, but many of which actually are not. They're probably illiterate. So there is that bit of a distinction to be made. Admittedly, most witches were women, but not exclusively so. And again, it depends a lot on the place and the time that you're looking at.
If I may interrupt you again, we have a question from the chat.
Yes.
What activities would make a person suspect?
Again, it depends a lot on the context, on the situation. So, in a pre-industrial society, which is what we're looking at, a lot of people had at least some basic knowledge of how herbs and natural remedies might help them in their day-to-day lives. And that in itself would probably not be a cause of suspicion. However, when that repertoire of knowledge gets associated with other things that's where you might draw suspicion. Let me just find you an example to illustrate that. Now, many of the examples that I'll be referring to come from the records of the Roman Inquisition of Malta, whose job was precisely to police these kinds of ideas, because they went against the teachings of the church. So here's an example from 1650. There were these two knights. They were both Italian. One was called Giovanni Minutilli, and the other Giovanni Antonio. They didn't give his surname in this case. So Giovanni Minutilli, Giovanni Antonio. They were called in to help out in the case of a person who was having something that we would probably think of as an epileptic fit. He was shaking, shaking rather violently. These two knights are asked to intervene, and we're told that somehow they managed to calm down this person by whispering words and phrases into his ears. And that's where the suspicion starts coming in. What are they whispering into his ears? Now, they tell the Inquisitor that they were whispering Christian words and phrases taken from the Mass, which you might think that in itself is innocent enough. However, from the point of view of the church, that was a wrong practice, because only the priest has the authority to use that kind of language in the framework of the Mass. When you're taking something out of the Mass and using it in a different context, that will draw suspicion on you, because you're manipulating something which is sacred, potentially using it for something which could be evil, or if not necessarily diabolical, it might be verging at least on the superstitious, on the ignorant, and possibly on something that could be harmful. So, this is how things happen. You don't need something very, very dramatic. What you need is these kinds of situations where things that belong in one setting, the Mass, get used in a different kind of setting.
So it's literally anything which might look out of the ordinary. Like you said, if herbalism is common, then it's not suspicious. But something like this would be.
Yeah. In fact, I'll just say something here, since we mentioned the Mass, and I've got the slide appearing. So the Sabbath is the generic word that is used in Jewish and Christian traditions to refer to the day of rest. In Jewish tradition, it's Saturday. In the Christian tradition, it's Sunday. We don't use it a lot in Malta, but in more English-speaking traditions, it's a fairly commonly used term. The obverse to that, the perversion to that, was what was referred to as the witches' Sabbath. And this was quite a widespread idea across Europe, that witches would get together on the Sabbath, so on the Sunday. Then they would perform all these grotesque rituals, which were the inverse of what the Mass should be. So they would, perhaps profane the host, or they would sacrifice animals, maybe even children. They would indulge in feasting and trying to link up with the devil. And when you keep in mind this sort of general idea, you can understand why something like what our two protagonists, Giovanni and Joe Antonio, were doing, would draw suspicion from the authorities, because it can easily evoke these kinds of situations, which were the common knowledge of the day. One has to say, and that's why the suspicion.
Okay, so it wouldn't need to be something related to anything that might be going wrong at the time, yeah?
Not necessarily. Of course, if the wider context is also problematic, say there's a drought, that might make things even more complicated. So it really depends on the situation. And of course on the person as well, as we may see in some of the other examples in a bit.
Okay. Okay, just to clarify, when these people were investigated, Giovanni Antonio and the other person, I'm sorry, I already forgot the name, they weren't automatically assumed to be witches, they were just investigated, right?
Yes, so, and again, the Inquisitor might not necessarily use the term witch or not even magic. But you can understand that that is what they are after. Now, this in itself is very interesting because there are ideas that we can see are common across Europe, like the idea that a witch rides a broom, for example, to fly. That's very, very widespread idea. And funnily enough, once you get the printing press from the 15th century, the printing press, of course, is good at spreading knowledge, but it also helps to spread all kinds of ideas, including things related to magic and witches. So you get little pamphlets with reproductions of, say, a witch riding a broom, and that helps to cement the idea, and from Portugal to Malta to Iceland, that this is what witches do. So it's fascinating to see that you have certain ideas that really cross borders, which are political and religious. So they're shared between Catholics and Protestants. But then you do have things that are specific to particular regions and places, and that includes the way that authorities prosecute. There's quite a difference between Catholic areas and Protestant areas. In Protestant areas, the witch hunts tend to be much more intensive.
In Protestant areas?
Yes, and this is something that tends to surprise us today, but in fact, it is the reality. So, for instance, places like Scotland, which was Calvinist, had some of the most intensive and violent witch hunts. The same was the case across parts of Germany. Of course, Germany didn't exist. You had something called the Holy Roman Empire, which was made up of all these little states. Part of it seems to have been related to religion itself, because certain strands of Protestantism really emphasized the depraved nature of humanity, that man is a fallen creature. Then that really pushed for prosecutions that tended to be more intensive. Perhaps the most famous case of a witch craze happened in the 1690s in North America, in Massachusetts, the Salem witch trial, which to date still evokes all kinds of reactions because it was a pretty violent episode. By contrast, in Catholic areas, where you had in particular the Roman Inquisition operating, like in Malta, you do have witches and witchcraft investigations, but it's less intensive, and even the punishments tend to be less intensive. This has a lot to do again with theology. So in Catholic thinking, there is the very important notion of free will, and therefore how you go about magic involves this rather complicated theological framework. And the inquisitors, which tended to be very learned individuals, many of them trained in law, essentially believed that most people, even the most educated, could not actually reach a pact with the devil, which was necessary to practice magic, because they simply did not have the knowledge to do that. So most of the time, they would dismiss cases of alleged witchcraft more as cases of ignorance, where, as it were, pastoral care and education was what is needed. In fact, locally, we see the Roman Inquisition very rarely giving out severe punishments for cases of at least alleged witchcraft. because this was the reasoning. So you do find quite a significant difference in the way that things are approached.
Excuse me, if I remember correctly, the difference between the excuse me, the Roman and the Spanish Inquisition was that the Roman Inquisition had to hand over the accused to the state, if I remember correctly, if there was a major punishment.
Not exactly. So as Inquisitions, Spanish and Roman worked on fairly similar models in terms of their structure. The key difference was that the Roman Inquisition answered directly to the Pope. Hence, that's why we call it the Roman Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition, on the other hand, answered to the Spanish monarchy. So whereas it was a tribunal of the church, at the same time, it was like a department of government because it really fell under the jurisdiction of the crown.
Of course.
The way the Spanish Inquisition dealt with cases of witchcraft was in many ways very similar to the Roman one as well, especially as they move into the 17th century and the more intensive sort of craze of the 16th century with so the fear of Jewish and Muslim converts kind of subsides, and then they move to other things.
Okay, and we have another question here. Was it the church that instigated most hunts, or was it usually word of mouth from the local community?
In the case of the Roman Inquisition, the tribunal itself never. Now, probably someone might find a case to prove me wrong. I would say in most cases, it was not the tribunal that began the process, but it was someone who went to the inquisitor to report someone else. Then the inquisitor would take that bit of information and carry out the investigation himself. That is the general rule for all kinds of cases, so not just the ones related to magic. That is how the Roman Inquisition operated, which again is a bit different from Protestant areas, where you did have tribunals or forms of, let's call them police. Of course, they're not exactly a police force, but some kind of enforcement authority that might actually take action itself. We know that, for instance, King James VI of Scotland and First of England, he was a complete believer in magic and witches. He wrote a book on the subject. One time he was going to be shipwrecked, and he believed that that was the work of witches. And he himself instigated quite significant investigations and persecutions of alleged witches. That was not so much the case, certainly in Malta with the Roman Inquisition model, and in many other Catholic areas.
So to frame it differently, in areas where there was the Roman Inquisition, you didn't get the kind of mass hysteria, witch finders, and so on. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there were moments when one could see hysteria.
All right.
Especially if you get, I know, for instance, the 1630s locally, they were quite difficult. There you had drought, you had an outbreak of plague, threat of war, invasion.
Okay.
There were a couple of years that were very intensive. So we do see some moments of hysteria there, where people are pointing fingers at each other and so on. But you don't really get them to the extent, to the scale that you find in some parts of Germany and Scotland, for example. In general, in Europe, those were the areas where these kinds of events tended to be most intensive.
Okay, and one more question, please. How were witches tested in Malta?
Right. We know that in Protestant areas, they would have these tests involving floating. Now, if the person floats, then she must be a witch. If she drowns, or not. Or you could pierce their skin to see if blood comes out or not. I've not really come across things like that here. Although I will premise that I mostly looked at cases involving the knights. And my assumption is that being knights, coming from powerful families and whatnot, probably the inquisitor would have had to moderate his approach. But again, the model tended to be more one based on intensive questioning of the person, as well as trying to question as many witnesses as possible to extract information. Torture could be used. Again, I don't think I've really come across cases of knights being tortured because their social status would have protected them. And here you had a sort of a bit of a interesting jurisdictional issue. The Inquisitor could investigate knights. This was sort of a concession that the Inquisition had managed to extract from the Pope from the very beginning. However, the understanding was that the Grand Master would have a kind of, could keep an eye on the proceedings. So it was a sort of balancing act. And that is why I think torture was not used or very rarely used on knights. It was used on other individuals, particularly women, who were always a bit more vulnerable. The torture that was used locally, again, tended to be very regulated. So I'm not justifying it, mind you. But there were sort of manual of procedures. And you couldn't, for instance, torture someone unless a doctor or physician was present. Now you tell me that's nice, but the idea is that, you know, there are limitations. So it's not what you might see in movies, these horrendous, brutal, you know, cutting and chopping and whatnot. Mostly it's things like stretching, pulling, and so on, hanging people from their hands, the strappado, as they used to call it. But it couldn't go on forever either. Usually, you know, not more than 15 minutes, which, you know, again, I'm not saying that it was good, but it's a very regulated structure, unlike what we might usually imagine. Because the idea is that you want to gain a confession so that you can save their soul. But you don't want them to be lying. I mean, the Inquisitors were very much aware that under torture, people say pretty much anything. So again, there's a balancing act that is happening there.
Okay. And was a witch typically identified even if an inquisitor was involved? I think I think what Dungeon Matron is asking here is, if someone is brought before an inquisitor and accused of being a witch, did they tend to go towards, yep, she's a witch, or did they actually go through the process? From what you're saying, I think it's the latter.
Actually, most of the time they dismiss these accusations, precisely because they feel that the person in front of them simply doesn't really have the capacity to go into all the elaborateness that real magic was involved, that is the pact with the devil, and so on. But most of the time, the punishments are things like appointing a confessor to follow that person for a number of weeks or months.
Kind of like a probation officer?
So, sort of, yes. Obliging them to follow mass, asking them to perform charity and acts of contrition. It's really more on those lines most of the time, rather than, you know, some really horrific punishment as we might tend to imagine. One of the more kind of extreme punishments that was given, I've certainly found knights being given this, is what we call public abjuration. Public abjuration means that you will go into a public space. Very often, thinking of the local example, it was the square in Birgu, which, you know, is quite a big open space. And there you would have to, in front of people, proclaim your misdemeanors and your willingness now to seek forgiveness and go back to the straight way, as it were. The idea, of course, is humiliation for the individual, but also it's a sort of, you know, teaching exercise for the community. this is what you should not be doing. Because in this way, you're deviating from the teachings of the church. Psychologically, of course, it's a very kind of it doesn't harm you physically, but psychologically, emotionally, it's a very difficult thing to do.
Especially
crowds, of course, would be rowdy. They would jeer you, they would laugh at you, they might even throw things at you. Again, depending on who you are, probably it might be a bit less traumatic, but still, it is quite a traumatic experience, I think, for one to go through.
Yeah, especially given the importance of one's reputation.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
In fact, sometimes I found instances where a knight might be given this punishment to abjure in public, but after a bit, this is changed to a private abjuration. Probably he's pulled a few strings among his powerful patrons, and so instead of going to the main square in Birgu, he would abjure in a private room, maybe in the palace of the Inquisitor or some other place. They still have a little bit of an audience, but of course it's less humiliating than being in the public square.
Yeah, absolutely, especially for a noble, like all the knights were, abasing yourself in front of a crowd of commoners, whatever it would have been.
Exactly. So it's quite significant. I wonder if we could speak perhaps a bit about the kinds of magic that the knights tended to be accused about.
Oh, yes, please.
What do you think?
Yes, please.
Let me share my screen again for a moment, Carl, please.
Coming up.
Oops. There we go. So from my own studies, I found that knights tended to be accused mainly of these 4 kinds of magical practices, which I've listed here. So magic to find lost items or persons. So basically some kind of spell that would help you to find something that you've lost, or someone, usually slaves that have run away. Which is not too different. I don't know about yourself, Carl, but sometimes if I can't find something, I still fall into that habit of asking St. Anthony to help me. St. Anthony kind of thing.
Yeah.
St. Anthony help me to find lost items. They often were something like this, but they might also involve using some kind of object, like a magnet, for example. A magnet, of course, helps to find direction in a compass, no? And again, it's the combination of the words and the actions that might draw the suspicion. Then you had gambling magic. Gambling was often an issue, both when the knights were on their galleys, but also when they were on land in Malta. It's not exactly illegal, but it's also not encouraged, but people engage in it. They still do. And if one is engaging in gambling, you really want to win, probably. So if you can operate a bit of magic that can help you win when you're playing cards or dice, that sort of thing, that's good from that point of view. So for instance, I remember a case where someone had a ring, and allegedly in this ring was somehow imprisoned a spirit.
A
spirit that was meant to help him win when he's playing at cards. And of course, that is what the Inquisitor in particular was concerned with, the alleged referral to these spirits. The other 2 categories that I can talk more about, because they were more prevalent, was healing and protection magic, and love magic. Now, healing magic is a very interesting phenomenon. Remember that the knights had 2 main functions, really. On the one hand, they were warriors. They fought against Islam. On the other hand, they were healers. Remember that the generic label for them was precisely hospitalaires, no? From the word hospital, because after all, that is how they had begun many centuries earlier in Jerusalem, as a hospital. And of course, in Malta, they operated a hospital, the Holy Infirmary, which was a very sophisticated organization. What I have found is that many of them, over the years, picked up knowledge about how they might deal with certain illnesses or certain wounds. After all, say if you're involved in a battle, and it's swords and guns and arrows, it's very much one-to-one combat still in that age. It's very easy to get wounded, and it makes sense to know how to deal with these kinds of issues. So you see them drawing on knowledge of herbal remedies. For instance, the use of egg yolk, applying it to wounds. And from reading a little bit around the subject, I got to understand that egg yolk, in fact, has certain antiseptic properties to it. Now, they would not have understood that, but from experience, they did understand that egg yolk actually helps if you have an open wound. The thing is that when they're applying these kinds of mixtures and whatnot, very often they're uttering words again. Okay. Words that often are derived from a Christian framework. So say the Pater Noster, no, the Our Father. But they start changing a few words in it to help in this kind of ritual. And that is the side that the Inquisition would be interested in and would find problematic. This is linked with this, which is why I deal with them at the same time with protection magic. Again, if you're going into battle, it helps to have something that might protect you from bullets and arrows. So you find all kinds of amulets. Sometimes they're actual objects, like some kind of chain, perhaps, that you might wear around your neck. Or sometimes, which is also fascinating, they might be bits of paper with things scribbled on them. The idea that the written word has a lot of power is very prevalent in these times. And again, what are these words? Some of them are derived from a Christian repertoire. Some of them, however, are clearly Muslim. You know, they're getting them from Muslims, maybe even their own Muslim slaves. They're getting things like this, and we can talk about where they're getting these things from. Now, a bit later on in this Q&A, we're going to talk about the body, so we can come back to this as well, to this healing, because when I'll explain a bit how they understood the way the body worked, you'll see how this healing magic worked. Love magic is very fascinating, I find. Now we go back. Oops, sorry. So, of all the accusations that were put against knights in relation to magic, a whole 1/3, so it's a lot, a whole 1/3 was related to love magic. Now, by love magic, we mean that you use something, a potion, a charm, an incantation, through which you try to make a woman fall in love with you, or at least let you have her way with her.
One second, Doctor. Just as a reminder, in case anyone is not familiar with Hospitallers, the members of the order were supposed to be celibate.
Yes, yes, exactly. They had a vow of chastity. So mostly this is addressed towards women, sometimes to men as well. That's not to be excluded. We should remember that as well. Now, I find this fascinating in many ways. I'm sure Carl and maybe many of your followers might have this image often found in history books and so on of the knight being swashbuckling, womanizers. If they see a woman in the street, they'll just grab her and have their way with her and whatnot. But actually, many of them are going through a lot of trouble if they happen to become interested in a woman. They're going out to seek a person who has a reputation for love magic. And there's a nice range of these people. Sometimes they're Muslim slaves. Sometimes they're prostitutes. Prostitute would be a logical person to go to for something like this. It could be some old woman. Old women often feature because, again, they're assumed to know these things. Sometimes it's other knights who somehow have gained a reputation for knowing about these things. From the point of view of the Inquisitor, what he was worried about with this kind of thing was the concern that love magic could undermine the free will of a person. We mentioned this a bit earlier. Free will is an absolutely fundamental notion in Catholic thinking. Each one of us is given free will by God to either do good or do bad. The end result is certainly up to us. What love magic is doing is that it's undermining that free will. Now, you're saying that if I'm putting a bit of love magic on you, Carl, I'm taking away your free will and you're doing my bidding, essentially. Now, that is serious in itself from the eyes of the church. But there's also the problem that you could go to the Inquisitor and simply say, oh, well, it's not my fault that I've done this and that because my free will was undermined by him or by her, which may be true or maybe not. So you see how it can get quite complicated.
Yeah, definitely.
And why they took this so seriously, whereas for us, on the face of it, it might look a bit silly. But there's a fundamental theological issue that comes to play here. How did it work? There were some remedies which were fairly common. So, for example, you get hold of a piece of clothing of the person that you're interested in, or a piece of their hair, and you take that to someone, unless you know how to do it yourself, to cast a spell on it. It's what we call binding magic, that somehow by putting a spell on that piece of clothing, piece of hair, you're binding the will of the person to do your bidding. Another common way of doing it was to sneak into that person's food, say a cake, a potion. I know you had Emanuel Buttigieg some weeks ago speaking about food. Food is a very important element in all societies. If you present, say, a cake or something that is delectable to someone, they're very likely to accept it and eat it. And the idea is that when they're eating it, if you've slipped a potion into that is becoming part of their body now. And again, a bit later today, we might speak about how the body was understood to work. But by ingesting this, you're subverting that person's free will, and they will fall in love with you or do what bidding you might ask of them. And these were fairly standard. And then occasionally there were a bit more colorful practices. One particularly gruesome one. This knight was told to find a dog, wrench out its heart while it was still beating, so very gory. And as soon as he does this, as he wrenches out the heart from the poor dog, drive a nail through the heart and pronounce the name of the woman that he was interested in.
That's kind of extreme, but yeah, okay.
But again, it's always this idea of binding. The nail through the heart while you're pronouncing the name is binding the will of that person to your being, to what you want of them. And at least I found quite a number of instances of this. Of course, sometimes a knight could himself be the victim of love magic by another woman, occasionally a man, who might be interested in him. So, of course, this was not a one-way thing. You could receive as much as you could give yourself. Broadly speaking, that's the panorama of the kind of magical practices that many knights indulged in, and many of them did, in fact.
Okay, just 2 points about healing and protection magic. With regards to healing, I'm very surprised that they indulge in it so much, because we're looking at an organization that was at the top level of medical research at their time, no?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of get to a level of despair to go that further.
In fact, most of the time when I found these kinds of examples, they were happening in rather extreme situations, as you alluded, say in the thick of a battle.
I see. All right.
And the physician might not immediately be at-handed at all. So, and of course, remember, earlier on, you had one of these episodes with Franco Davis, swords, fighting techniques, and whatnot. Probably, if you're in a battle on a galleon and so on, you are with a group of men who, at the very least, are your peers. They might be your very close friends. Some of them might be your relatives. It's quite common to have uncles and nephews at the same time within the organization. And in any such organization, you can think even just of a football team, no? Mates tend to try to look out for each other.
I think it's the same dynamics that you see with any kind of close-knit group.
Exactly.
It's like family, yeah.
So if your fellow knight, or not always a knight, sometimes it's other members of the crew that somehow you feel responsible for, needs you, and you know this particular procedure, they do and use it to deal with the situation that they're faced in at the moment. Back in Malta, of course, they have a hospital. So if one is sick or so on, you can go there. There's professional doctors and surgeons and so on. But even there, sometimes you find the occasional magical practice sneaking in and so on, because the line is very thin, really, between faith and magic.
Yeah, absolutely.
It has always been. In fact, it's a thin line between magic, faith, and medicine very often. They're really a continuum in most people's minds, and certainly in this age.
Okay, and with regards to protection magic, I recall reading, if I remember correctly, it was about the German tradition of judicial duels. I forget if it was Franconian or Swabian, but definitely German. One of the duties of the heralds would be to search the contestants for any writings or drawings.
I see. That makes perfect sense, in fact.
Yeah, it's if I remember correctly, it's from the 12th or 13th century. So seeing that it survived that long and then extended to Muslim writings and so on, it's very interesting.
It's a practice that's certainly continuing in the 16th to 18th centuries. And again, as I said earlier, because there is this fascination with the power of writing. After all, only a small amount of people in any society at this time know how to write. And it might surprise some people, but even a lot of knights might not necessarily know how to write very well. Because for most of them, actually, it was more important to know how to read than to necessarily how to write. Now, today we tend to think that the two have to go together. But in certainly pre-industrial societies, it was not necessarily the case.
Right.
And that is why writing, especially if then you can add fancy-looking characters, especially Muslim, Arabic-looking characters, they add the mystery to the aura of it. And you still find in the archive of the Inquisition examples of these, which I always find incredibly fascinating to look at. And as you say, you put them on your person because you believe that they will protect you.
We have two other questions here. Were dowsing rods used in Malta, and were dowsers suspected of being witches? I think this one is interesting because we do have a long history of needing water and looking for water here.
I didn't understand the question, Carl. Could you repeat, please?
Were dowsing rods used in Malta, and were dowsers suspected of being witches?
Dowsing rods are those implements that draw water, or
that people used to search for sources of water. That typical stick
okay,
and.
Okay. Yes. I can't think of an example. So no, I'm afraid I can't answer that one. I've not come across an example like that. Certainly, objects were used in magical rituals. As I said, things like amulets, writings, rods made out of different materials, which I suppose would be something similar to these dowsing objects. So yeah, most of the time a magical ritual involves an object, which adds to the mystery of it. But I can't think of an example related to that particular practice.
Okay. And let's see. Okay. Did Maltese witches have familiars? Or is there any mention of them in the records?
Familiars in the sense of relatives?
I think magical familiars in this context.
Okay. Yes. Again, what I've looked at mostly are knights. So I can't speak of sort of local practitioners. But I would recommend the books by Carmel Cassar on this subject, who has a whole book specifically on local witchcraft. I can't say that I've seen evidence of knights having these sort of magical familiars. On the other hand, it is obvious that they talk to each other, that they instruct each other, usually older members to younger members, that some of this knowledge is obviously being passed down one from the other. And what makes the Maltese scenario interesting is that while Malta itself is very small and, it's the periphery of Europe ultimately, it's really not important in the grand scheme of things. But because the knights come from so many different places, because they draw people from so many different places, because you also have a lot of Muslim slaves on the island, so in a very small place, you have people from so many different backgrounds. Spanish and Italians and French and Germans and Muslims and the local Maltese. And you do have a feel that the kind of magical practices that therefore you find here are this incredible mishmash of influences from all kinds of areas. And as I said a bit earlier, some things are very standard across Europe, but then some other things are very particular. And the particularity of Malta and the galleys as well, because a galley is a mini world in itself.
Of course, yeah.
A mixture of all of these ideas, which I find so fascinating. There's a particular anecdote, for example, where this Maltese man is in front of the Inquisitor, and he tells him, well, I was in the tavern and I met this Italian gentleman who had spoken to the French knight who had told him, it's almost like one of those jokes, three men walk in a bar, one is Maltese, one is Italian. It's almost like that. And I imagine that because of there is an element of a lingua franca, of some kind of language that they all understand, but I'm sure that there were also lots of instances of things being lost in translation and misunderstood between these different languages. And again, it adds to the fascination of this particular sort of laboratory that Malta and the galleys were.
Yeah,
So sorry, a
absolutely.
bit of a long-winded answer to that question, but that's the sort of perspective that I have of it.
No, I love these diversions. They're still fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Okay, you were talking about punishments earlier. What kind of punishments were associated with these transgressions? Let's call them that way.
Mhm.
Were they kind of the same level, or were some punished more heavily than others?
Let me stop share for now because I don't need it. So as I said earlier, actually, most of the punishments are pretty lenient. They are things like being appointed, having a confessor that is going to follow you and instruct you in the correct thinking about the faith, having to attend mass with a certain regularity, performing charity. In general, there is the sense that what happened with this individual, from the point of view of the Inquisitor, is that he's gone astray. What he's done is not terribly bad most of the time. So what he needs is someone to gently or with a bit of force guide him back onto the correct path through these kinds of measures. There's the abjuration that we talked about as well. One has to bear in mind also what we mentioned, that when the Inquisitor is dealing with the knights, he knows that he's dealing with people that can often draw on powerful networks, not least in Rome itself, as well as in their countries of origin and so on. So that has to also be taken into account in what is doable. But again, the aim is not so much to inflict some kind of horrific punishment. It's really more to try and guide them so that hopefully they will not repeat this. I can't say that I've come across repeat offenders.
All right, I was just going to ask that, in fact. Yeah.
Or they might have just got smarter about it. And of course, a lot of knights would only have been in Malta periodically and for short periods of time, because many of them are spending most of the time on the galleys or living and working in other parts of Europe. So I wouldn't exclude that perhaps someone who was investigated here might then be investigated in Rome or in Paris or somewhere else. So that also has to be kept in mind.
Okay, this is an interesting question. We've been talking about knights being accused, but were priests or inquisitors ever put in front of an investigation like this?
Oh, priests, yes. Both priests that were members of the order, because the order had its own priests, the conventual chaplains, as well as the local clergy. So there's quite a number of cases of those, yet again. Inquisitors themselves, no. Partly because you only have one inquisitor on the island, so he can't prosecute himself. Inquisitors who might be suspected of not doing their job properly, but not necessarily because of magic, might be called back to Rome. And most of them were here for very short appointments, on average 3 years, 4 years. They tended to be rotated quite regularly, so maybe not have enough time to indulge. There is a fascinating episode. It's not exactly magic, but it does tap into the same kind of world from the 1630s. I think it's 1639, if I'm not mistaken, when the Grand Master Antoine de Paul was dying. And de Paul was known as a bit of a bon vivant, someone who enjoyed his good food and wine and partying. He certainly had one long-term mistress in his life. And when he was dying, a rumor spread all over Malta that a little devil called Scrampino, I love the name, was seen dancing on his chest. And that Scrampino was prolonging the agony of the Grand Master. People went to the Inquisitor, who happened to be Fabio Chigi, an incredibly learned man who, after Malta, a few years after Malta, would go on to become Pope Alexander VII. So, a very, very intelligent, learned, and well-connected man. And Chigi, in his letters to the Pope, is saying, I refuse categorically to go to the Grand Master to perform some kind of, what do you call it?
Exorcism.
Because of this Scrumpy, this is total nonsense. This is what the ignorant people believe. There's no such thing as evil spirits and dancing stuff, which is interesting. You can see how within the same society, people can hold very, very different views. And like someone like Keith, for example, is very skeptical about this whole thing. He is like, just let the man die. It's his time. But it all goes back to what we were saying. You might have a spirit in your ring, or you might be trying to make this pact with the devil. It's all part of a mentality that is very prevalent in that society. It's a lovely story.
Oh dear, I believe you have just inspired someone to name their cat Scrampino.
I like the name.
It's a nice name. Okay.
I wonder if there's more questions, or perhaps
No,
if you want,
no more questions right now. No.
We could talk a bit about the body,
Mhm.
and then maybe leave violence to the end, because perhaps
please.
they pick up. Okay. I'll share my screen again if you don't mind.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, give me a second. I never understand why PowerPoint doesn't go where you want it to go, but there you go. Okay. You should be seeing a sort of diagram, right?
Yes.
Okay. So what we're seeing here is something that was absolutely fundamental to the way that people understood their bodies and really the universe. So it's something that was called the theory of the humors. Now, this is a very old idea, an idea that went all the way back to the ancient Greeks, to people like Aristotle and Hippocrates, but in particular to a physician who was called Galen. And it's really Galen who elaborates the theory of the humors that really would continue throughout the classical world, the Middle Ages, the early modern period, and really to the 19th century. So this is an idea that is really resilient and which a lot of people were absolutely familiar with. What does it argue? So it argues that every individual consists of four humors, four elements. The four elements being, and you can see them in this diagram, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And the idea is that in each of us, there is a slightly different configuration. So my humoral composition is different from yours, Carl, which is why we have different characters, We do things differently, we relate to the world differently, and so on. So it's not just about health, but it's really about character as well. And again, it's about how we relate to the wider world. And as this diagram is showing, each of these elements, each of these humors, tends to be associated with a certain time of the year. So yellow bile is linked to summer and to fire and to hotness and dryness. And if you're in Malta at the moment, you can perfectly relate to this. Whereas as you move into the seasons, black bile, it's more about autumn, phlegm is more about winter, so you're moving towards moistness and coldness. Then you get back into spring. So in other words, although each of us has a particular humoral makeup, this makeup changes with the seasons too. And it also changes according to the place where you happen to be. So warmer places tend to encourage a kind of setup, makeup, whereas colder places will encourage a slightly different configuration. Health, to be healthy, meant that your humoral balance was precisely in balance, so that the humors within you were just in the right kind of composition. When something happened that upset the balance between the humors, that's when you became ill. And this could be anything from the diets that you have, so how rich and nutritious or how poor your diet could be, the kind of environment that you're living in. Let's say the extreme environment of a galley could be harmful to your humoral balance. To also your sex life. So whether you're having sex or not having sex, or you're having the wrong kind of sex, that also impacts your humoral balance. So there's a lot that goes on. A lot of medicine, therefore, is about trying to reestablish a balance. And one of the best strategies to do that was something called bloodletting. And as the name implies, it's about piercing the body to release blood. And you had people called the barber surgeons that would carry out these operations, because that was understood to help in bringing back the balance. Of course, the hope is that your barber surgeon knows what he's doing, because you don't want to bloodlet someone to the extent that they that they die. That was a risk. But that was the general understanding. And if we think back when we were talking about love magic, for example, and I told you how someone could give you something to eat to have an effect on you, well, this is exactly the way it would work. By ingesting, say, a cake that has a potion in it, what that cake and potion are doing is altering your humoral balance.
Okay.
And therefore making you do what, or at least trying to make you do what that spell is trying to do. So you see how it all comes together very neatly in the way that they understood the world, and therefore how they went about it.
I think so, yeah. So basically, their worldviews that the body works like this.
Yeah.
Therefore, if we do this, something else will happen.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Now, there were sort of general ideas. So a man, usually, his composition should be more towards hot and dryness, whereas a woman should be more moist and cold in general. But then they would observe that certain women seem to be particularly physically strong, for example. So they would describe them as being virile women, in the sense that their humoral balance tends to tip a bit more towards the male. On the other hand, you might have men who appear a bit more delicate, what they would call a feminine man. So their humoral balance tends to be more towards the feminine. You might try to address these through diets or through exercise. Because the aim ultimately is also try to maintain the balance, because balance means that you are in the right way, as it were. That's what they will try and strive for. But it was not always possible, or of course, this often depended on the point of view of the person that was involved.
Okay. Right, we don't seem to have any questions so far.
So we can say a bit more about this. So this is an extract from a book by a knight of St. John. He was called Sabba Castiglione. You might be familiar with him, Carl, because in his book, Franco Davis
Definitely, yes.
refers to him a lot, because Sabba Castiglione basically wrote a guidebook for knights. And he talked about military training and weapons, but he also talked about the humors. And it's a bit long, but it's worth reading. So this is what he said. Since you are a knight of St. John, you will travel to different parts of the world and converse with various nations. So I will remind you that in every place and with all kinds of people, you should always be a true and good Christian. For you will notice how varied nature is in the German, the French, the Spanish, the English, the Italian, and of other nations of this world. This is because different climates impart different qualities. Remember that the melancholic is different from the choleric from the sanguine from the phlegmatic. This is because different complexions generate various and different properties. So I find this quite fascinating that what he's arguing, and perhaps we could even call them stereotypes, that as a knight you're probably going to meet a lot of different people. You will notice that, broadly speaking, Germans behave differently from the French, and the French from the Spanish, and it all boils down to the humors. Because coming from certain places, with certain climates, with certain diets, there is a certain national character in their humors. And then, of course, there's different characters. When he talks about choleric and melancholic, this is what he means. Some people are broody by nature. that is their humoral setup. Others are more sanguine, more energetic. And a good knight of St. John should know how to calibrate himself with all of these different kind of characters. So it's a wonderful world when you try and delve into it.
Oh, for sure. And it's especially interesting because Sabba di Castellone is relatively late in the day, and it's still the same model of
Absolutely. These ideas, the continuity is so powerful. I mean, of course, there are changes, but the continuity is really the powerful force throughout all of this.
And again, I mean, at this stage, we're saying that they still believe that this was how the body worked, but at the same time, they were performing successful surgeries of quite complex ones, if I remember correctly.
Yes, I mean, the section had already started. And in fact, there were some, like in the late 16th century, a very important physician called Vesalius, who, when opening up bodies, he was thinking, hold on, there really isn't any evidence here for humors. But he was, pretty much a lone voice in the desert still at that point. These ideas would really continue. And there's a fascinating example to help us also understand this a bit more. So in the 16th century, when Europeans were venturing to other parts of the world and they were bringing all kinds of exciting new things to Europe, in the 1540s, one of the things that was brought over, we have the first recorded instance of the tomato. Remember, the tomato is not native to Europe, but to the American continent. So before the 1540s, there were no tomatoes in Europe. The first recorded instance that we have is that a tomato, or a basket of them, was presented to the Grand Duke Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. And we're told that he and his court found this fruit fascinating. You know, it has this nice red shine to it. They had a bit of a taste of it. Initially, they called it with names like Poma Amoris or Pomme d'Amour, the love apple. But they were not really interested in eating it. And in fact, it would take 300 years for the tomato to really become part of the Italian, Mediterranean, and wider European diet.
300.
Really only in the 19th century. And the reason is because of the theory of the humors. Because when they tried to fit the tomato within their frame of mind, the tomato, as they saw it, had the significant disadvantage of being a rather moist and wet fruit.
Okay.
No? Now, if you remember the scheme that we looked at earlier, moistness and wetness were associated with women, with femininity. So if a man like the Grand Duke were to indulge in tomatoes, what would that do? That would unhinge his balance and potentially lead him down the slope of effeminacy. Of course, if you're a woman, the last thing you want is to eat these, because it would simply take you further down that slope. So because of that frame of mind, the tomato is really shunned for a very long time.
Purely based on the theory of humors, just purely based on that. All right.
Yes, and it changes in the 19th century, because it's only in the 19th century that the medical establishment and society more generally abandons the theory of the humors. And once that happens, the tomato is rehabilitated, as it were, and quite quickly then it really becomes part of the European diet. So it's fascinating to think that something like pasta al pomodoro, pasta with tomato sauce, it doesn't have a very long vintage, actually. It only really goes back to the 19th century. Before that, it would have been something rather different. You wouldn't have put them together, because it would have ruined it, essentially. So again, you see how it really influences the way they look at the world, not just their bodies, but how they relate to the wider world around them.
Yeah, I'm really surprised by this, because it's two entirely, in my head, it's two entirely unrelated things. Like, okay, we believe medicine works like this, therefore no tomatoes.
Yeah,
it's surprising.
And if we go back a little bit to healing magic, a lot of the understanding of healing magic was therefore, like love magic, very familiar with this idea of the theory of the humors. Because what you want to do with your healing magic is to restore the balance. Once again, that is very much the thinking. Now, we mentioned the whole infirmary, which was following what one could call the latest scientific thinking of the time. But beyond that, as we saw, you have various individuals who would engage in these kinds of practices. So, for example, I came across the case of this knight. He was a Frenchman, Fra de Clare. And he had a friend, he was called Cortes, who was at the whole infirmary. And we're told that he was languishing with a high fever. And somehow, whatever they were doing to him at the whole infirmary wasn't helping. So Fra de Clare goes to see his friend, and I'll read it out to you. using certain holy and good words, using a rod of willow, and he had a mass celebrated for a saint held by the infirm that helped the commander Cortes to feel better. So again, it's all of these things. Now the words we mentioned earlier, using an object, a rod of willow, but also paying for someone to say a mass for the benefit of Cortes. And all of this is intended to somehow restore the balance of this individual, of the poor Cortes, who had been languishing in the holy infirmary with a fever. Another example, which is also very fascinating, towards the early 17th century, we had a knight who was from Spain. He was called Antonio Moreto Giron, and he was the captain of the village of Birkirkara here in Malta. For those who are not familiar, the knights had a system where they sort of divided the island into kind of districts, parishes, and for each of these, they would appoint a knight to serve as its captain. So in this case, we have Moreto Giron, who was the captain of Birkirkara, already one of the larger communities on the island, beyond the harbor. And I found a number of instances referring to him where not just knights, but local people from Birkirkara, bearing in mind Birkirkara in those days meant a rather wide area, stretching all the way to St. Julian's and so on, who went to him for all kinds of medical ailments. And he saw them, he tried to help them. Most of the time it involved, again, these sort of practices. So he would say words, he would use rods and other objects. He might give them a bit of a potion, perhaps, to take away. Interestingly, he never charged a fee for these. So he seems to have thought of it as part of his calling as a hospitaller, to extend this kind of care. He was certainly one of those who used egg yolk that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes he would dip bandages in a sort of mixture with water, wine, oil, egg yolk again, which again he taught, and they seem to have worked to heal these kinds of wounds. The problem again was always, the use of a Christian frame of reference, as well as there were some women who accused him of touching them inappropriately.
Oh, okay.
Now, this is a difficult one to call, because what is happening? Is he really taking advantage of the situation and groping these women? And it happened, so it still does. So one can't exclude it. Or was this actually part of the whole ritual that he was trying to perform? Or perhaps it was something in between. It could depend, again, on the context. But this is how we learn about the whole thing, because some of these women who felt that he had been inappropriate towards them go to the Inquisitor. Now, the Inquisitor himself wasn't interested in the groping, because that's one of the things that actually didn't fall under the remit of the Inquisition, because technically it's not a religious misdemeanor. What interested the Inquisitor, and what the women were clever enough emphasized, was how he used those Christian words as part of his healing repertoire.
So
that's how we have the investigation.
Just to be clear, if he had done exactly the same process, just with his mouth shut, then it would have been perfectly okay?
Well, he would have been okay, but it would not have been the role of the Inquisitor to look into it. The women would have had to go to the Grand Master. because that would be, as it were, a secular offense.
No, I mean
rather
he would still have to
rather than a
go to
religious
the
one.
yeah. But with as far as the Inquisitor is concerned, then if he had just not said the words during the ritual or whatever,
Uh-huh.
it would totally not be something up to the Inquisitor then.
No, because there are different law courts with different jurisdictions, and the jurisdiction of the Inquisition is strictly, but at the same time widely, to do with religious
All right.
related offenses. Now that's very broad, but there were some things like rape or groping that in themselves did not actually fall under the remit of the Inquisition. They would have fallen under the remit of other legal structures,
The secular law to be
secular tribunal, or the Grand Master if knights were involved. So it's again a very, very wide-ranging and fascinating spectrum that one is looking at. And that's why, when we started, I said we should not laugh at them when they resort to these kinds of things, because really they are operating within the frame of mind that they have. Just as I'm sure in the future, someone looking back at us will probably think that whatever medical or other social habits we might have might be laughable, but for us they make sense because they're the framework that we have, and we can't operate outside of them.
That's definitely the case. In fact, basically they were going by the best information they had at the time in most cases.
Yeah. And some of them were doing it very well in a sense. they knew their business.
So, quick look at the chat. So, Dungeon Matron is saying, I really wish I could attend these classes. This is fascinating stuff. Yes, it is.
Good.
Also,
Maybe he'll follow the diploma.
melancholic is psychological, isn't it? I didn't know there was a related bodily fluid.
Well, there isn't technically, I think, but this is how they understood it. And yes, so what they call melancholy today, we would call things like depression. But again, melancholy was understood, it was a spectrum in itself. There could be temporary melancholy. I think we can all relate to this. We do all have moments in our life where we feel down, but then we get up from it, perhaps by ourselves, perhaps with a bit of help. But there are people who seem to be always or regularly melancholic, and therefore they might need assistance, medical assistance, emotional. So the kinds of measures that we're talking about, again, why are words so important? Well, because they didn't know about psychology, but they did understand the power of words, that words can lift you up. And it makes sense for them to turn to Christian words because it's a Christian society. And after all, the Bible itself has a lot of words of consolation within it. There are lots of words of condemnation. There are lots of words of consolation. So you can understand why they would resort to that. In the 17th century, there was also a bit of a fashion among elite young men to be melancholic. In fact, there was a book by an English author, the name escapes me now, but the book was called Melancholy. And it is sort of an explainer of, how you could look demure, melancholic, in the right kind of way. As a gentleman of a certain breeding and so on, there was a moment when having that look was actually fashionable. Whenever I read these, they sort of remind me, as well, some of my children move into teenagehood, that teenagers like to brood, and it's sort of cool. And there are these 17th century antecedents for it as well, which again is fascinating.
Definitely. No, I was just thinking that that kind of thing sounds like one of the fashions you would get today, but nope, humans are still the same.
I always say there's very little that is new under the sun. Probably someone has thought about it and done it before.
100%. So I see that quite a few people have been shocked by the tomato revelation.
It's fascinating. If they're interested, there's a wonderful book by David Gentilcore, which is called Pomodoro, A History of the Tomato, and they can read all about it. It's absolutely fascinating.
Speaking of, Professor Buttigieg provided a reading list for anyone who wants to follow up this further.
Listed,
yeah, I'll post it in the comments after the stream. So let's see. Earthman Brick is saying, I can't imagine Italians not having a love for tomatoes. It seems unheard of.
Yes.
Okay, and Cross is saying, it's even weirder to know pizza never had tomato sauce for the first 6,000 years it existed. That's also true.
I remember myself some years ago when I was still in Cambridge. I once attended an event where they reconstructed, or rather, they made a pizza from a 15th century recipe. And it was completely different to what we would imagine. It had things like raisins on it, nuts, peaches. Basically, it's a bit of almost bread with fruit. Because, as I said, this is a 15th century recipe, a whole 100 years before the first tomato even reaches Europe, let alone it becomes part of the way a pizza is prepared. It simply wasn't there, so you couldn't use it.
Yeah, I think I recall an episode of Max Miller's Tasting History where he cooks a much smaller version of the 15th century recipe. It sounds more like a cake, to be honest.
Yeah, almost. And again, going back to what Emanuel Buttigieg said in your previous episode, food is very telling of a society, of what is available to it, what it shows about it. And again, as Noel said, the presence of the Knights in Malta means that often a lot of these things are reaching Malta quite quickly.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily that they're catching on, because even today, something might arrive and no one might fancy it. But they do come in. There is an awareness of them. They might be used. They might not be used. And all these elements, because again, the distinction between food and medicine is not as clear cut as it might be in our own imagination. It's really part, once again, of this continuum between religion, magic, medicine, food, because of the humoral theory. It's such a powerful framework. And when we're studying the past, I think we should always bear it in mind, certainly before the 19th century, because it's a real frame of reference for people. And you don't have to be particularly literate to be aware of it. It's clear that most people have at least an awareness of it.
Yeah, I mean, as this discussion goes on, I'm thinking more like I should stop thinking of these people as doing superstitious stuff, but rather trying to do science in a way.
Yeah, well, they try to be methodic.
Yeah, exactly.
That's for sure. But I'm glad if that changes a bit your mind.
No, that's definitely enlightening. It's definitely that. Let's see. We have a couple of more questions here, if you don't mind. Makes me wonder if food flavors were considered feminine or masculine, or how they were categorized, I guess. How would someone decide, okay, this food is masculine, this food is feminine?
Definitely, there is a sense that some foods are more manly than others, as we saw. So meat, for instance, particularly meat from, basically beef and related kind of products, were seen to be manly. And of course, only small sections of society could really consume meat regularly, which is why elites would indulge in them. And famously, gout was a disease of the rich, because they indulged too much. And their physicians, in fact, would tell them to cut back on the meats because they were upsetting their hormonal balance. But because of an issue of status, but also because perhaps they just like the taste, they would ignore. I mean, just like today, I mean, your doctor might tell you your cholesterol is high and you should cut down on cheese and whatnot. But if you like it, it's hard.
Yeah, it's easier said than done.
Yeah. So it's exactly the same kind of thing. There's a sense with vegetables also that fruits, that things that grow near the ground are not as exciting and might be more feminine, whereas things that grow on trees are better in the pecking order.
All right.
So that is also something that is influencing. I'm sure there is much more. I don't really know how much or in what ways more humors and food are related. It's not an area I've actually looked at a lot myself. But certainly the link is there, and it affects consumption and what people will eat, or how much. Because I don't know, there might be something that is not good for you, but you might indulge every now and then because it's okay, but you wouldn't want to do it regularly.
Okay, let's see. Lawrence Davis. Hi, Lawrence. Definitely want to read the history of the tomato book, especially being that I have a garden that is 75% tomato plants. Well, I'll be sure to post the references later.
Sure. I'm sure they'll enjoy them.
Okay, and maybe we can move on to the next section, I guess.
Talk a bit about violence to close up.
Yeah, let's talk about violence.
Okay. We were talking about healing, so now we go to that. I'll share my screen for a moment again, Carl.
Coming up. All yours.
Okay, so in talking about all of these things, violence often features. Now we saw how they would practice certain kinds of healing magic because they had wounds. Now, of course, the wounds are not happening by themselves; they're happening because they're fighting Muslims, or fighting between themselves. Now, anyone who is interested in the subject of violence, I would heartily recommend reading a paper that was written back in 1979, but is still extremely relevant. And it's called The Rights of Violence by Nathalie Simon-Davis, who was a very important historian of France in particular. And with this paper, she really set a standard to which we still turn to. The knights engaged in physical violence, in verbal violence, and what one could even call spiritual kind of violence. Again, Malta is small, but because of the presence of the knights, you have all these different currents that meet here. And again, the Roman Inquisition Tribunal is useful because people go to it to tell about other people. It's quite common that when the galleys come back to Malta, you see, or at least this is something I imagine, but it's not, I'm sure it's not far from reality, so a guy sneaking up to Birgu, to the Inquisitor, to tell about his mates. For example, in 1642, the knight Roberto de Pinzorola was reported to the Inquisitor for blaspheming while he was on the galleys. He pronounced these words, blood of God and bowels of God, which were considered to be blasphemous utterances. And that's the sort of verbal violence that I'm referring to earlier. And again, context is very important, as the historian Peter Berg says. Things that might look very meaningless to us actually make sense once you put them in a framework and you try to understand what is actually happening and where that's happening. Now, I tend to categorize the violence of the knights into two: functional and dysfunctional. And we can quickly have a look at these various forms. Functional violence is when they fought with Muslims, like we see in this picture here. So a troop of knights attacking a Muslim fortress. From the point of view of the church and of, I suppose, Western society, that's good violence because it's being channeled towards the enemy. It's keeping all these hot bloods busy. And of course, if they're fighting over there, they're not causing disruption over here. And on the other hand, dysfunctional violence is that kind of violence which disrupts your local social order. And there's a lot of evidence for this, the knights engaging in this kind of dysfunctional violence. And it's in a sense natural, because this is a much more violent society than what we tend to be used to today. Many of them come from the nobility, which has a certain understanding of how violence operates. It's part of their identity. And very often we have an all-male group setting, and we've all been in all-male group settings where we tend to cheer each other on in certain behaviors, which perhaps we wouldn't otherwise. It's that sort of male bravado. And often you have food, you have drink, you have gambling, you have blasphemy, that all come together to create these kinds of situations. So for instance, let's see, violence against lesser men. What do I mean by this? Because many of the knights hail from the nobility, they do tend to look down upon certain other categories of society. For instance, there were often clashes between knights and Inquisition officials. Why? Because Inquisition officials were not often nobles themselves. And they would be sent by the Inquisitor to summon a knight to appear in front of the Inquisitor. And knights felt that was detrimental to their honor. How dare you, a lesser man than me, pretend that you can actually order me about? And most of the time, when an Inquisition official went to fetch a knight, almost invariably it ends up in a brawl. If maybe just between the two of them, but often actually it's a group fight, group of knights against a group of Inquisition officials. They will still go to the Inquisitor, but as a point of honor, it almost seems compulsory that they have to have a fist fight to push the point that
it's sounding a bit like the Three Musketeers and the Cardinal's Guard kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's exactly the spot on. So honor is very important. Violence against women. Now, as knights, they were duty bound to defend women, and they often did. However, you do have a lot of examples of knights being violent towards women. For instance, I looked at a sample in the archives of the knights from 1572 to 1604, and I came across many instances of knights hitting women, abusing them verbally, throwing things at them, and so on. So clearly these kinds of behaviors happen, particularly if these women happen to be poor. Maybe they don't have men that can protect them. Often they're prostitutes. So again, they're a vulnerable group. From the archives of the Inquisition, you also get some particular cases. For instance, in the early 17th century, I came across the case of Pietro Reo Camarasa, who was a priest of the order. Not only a priest, he was actually the prior of the church, which means he was the most important priest in the order. Now, he was accused by a group of nuns, to whom he was their spiritual director, that he was behaving in an untoward way against them, touching them, groping them, trying to have affairs with them. And these nuns somehow communicate with the inquisitor about this situation. It's complicated because he's a very powerful man. And again, are the accusations true? Or are they being made up? You know, it was very familiar today. We have all kinds of situations like this. We certainly know that he is transferred, that he is not allowed to stay on as confessor to these women. So perhaps something was untoward. On the other hand, he carries on with his career with no problem at all. When he eventually dies in 1624, he was still the prior, he was still a very powerful individual. That is a form of violence in itself that is being practiced against these women. You were going to ask something, I think.
Yes. How did this? Because we mentioned earlier that if it was just, if it was harassment or that kind of thing, that would not end up in front of the inquisitor, or that was not the inquisitor's jurisdiction, so to speak.
Because in this case, we're talking of nuns.
Right.
Who did fall under the jurisdiction of the inquisitor for something like this, plus, and this is how they actually begin it, they also accuse him of propagating the wrong religious ideas.
Oh, all right.
See, so then the accusations of sexual misdemeanor add on to the problematics of the case. To go back to what you were saying, some women understood that, you know, they were always going to be disadvantaged because that's just the way things were. But they could understand that the system could be used to their advantage. So in 1696, there's the case of a prostitute called Anna De Masi. She goes to the inquisitor to report an Italian knight, Scipione Gaddi. And she has two accusations against him in this order. First of all, that he profaned the name of the Virgin. And secondly, that he attempted to rape her. Gaddi himself, when he's in front of the inquisitor, admitted that he and his mates were drunk and they had been a bit naughty that night, and that perhaps he had gone a bit too far. So he does admit it, actually. Herself, Anna, as I said, what she emphasizes most to the inquisitor is not the rape. I mean, she mentions it as a corollary. What she emphasizes was his blaspheming, his heresy, because she knew that if it was just a case of rape, there's very little she could do actually to get any redress. But if she put forward the religious misdemeanor and then added the other one, that's how she could get him to face some kind of punishment, at least. So, you know, you make do with a system that was very much stacked against women. But if you sort of used your mind a bit, there were ways of getting at least some level of justice in those situations. Slaves are another issue. Remember, there were a lot of Muslim slaves on the island, as well as some Jews and Africans, but mostly Muslims, usually captured at sea. And again, it's a very disadvantaged group because they don't have any freedom. their own bodies were marked by being forced to shave and only being able to have a sort of forelock or ponytail that would distinguish them as being slaves. And there's quite a lot of evidence that of knights acting quite cruelly towards their slaves, beating them or at least verbally abusing them. There is evidence of some sort of bond developing between some knights and their slaves as well. But clearly, it is a relationship of a complete imbalance of power. At the same time, if you remember, we said that very often they go to these same slaves for magical potions and talismans and whatnot. So it gets a very contradictory, fascinating kind of relationship. There was this case, for instance, in 1669 of a very young slave. He was called Soliman. He was 15 or 17 years old. And one day he decided to cut off his forelock. He proclaimed that he had seen St. Anthony in a dream. He went to see the relics of St. Clement in a local church. And he said that he wanted to convert from Islam to Christianity. When his master, who was a knight, heard of this, he gave him a beating. And he said, this is just an excuse. You don't want to become a Christian. You just want to escape and then be free. It's like, go away and go back to your job. So it could be very, very difficult situations again. And yet the relationship could be also very intimate. You could go to them for magical practices. They might be preparing your food if you have them in your household. So again, it's a complex kind of world. And finally, I would say something about violence among Hospitallers themselves. The most common form would be the duel. The duel being very much associated with the nobility. And you can understand, therefore, why the knights would indulge in it. It was illegal, it was condemned, but nevertheless, there's widespread evidence of it happening. I found quite a number of cases of duels happening in the area just outside Valletta, which is why I put up this map with that red rectangle there. Somehow it was thought that the area just beyond the gate, I don't know, maybe they felt it somehow, if it's just outside the gate, outside the walls, it's not quite as bad as if you're having it inside the city. And of course, there was a bit more open space there as well. So there might have been a bit of a practical consideration. So, the space where Floriana is, even when it starts being built, is still more open than what Valletta tended to be. And it's fascinating because, for instance, in 1533, we have this huge duel that takes place in Birgu and ends up becoming something of a civil war almost between French knights on the one hand and Italian and Spanish knights on the other. It's a real bloodbath. And that's why historians like Bosio and Verto record it in their books. The idea behind the duel was that actually it should be a hallmark of self-control. It's a kind of violence that should be very regulated. But sometimes, of course, it slips out of control. It happens. But there are sort of rules. A very important book was one called Il Duello by Girolamo Muzio. And we have evidence of copies of this book in Malta, long after it was published. Muzio is interesting because while he condemns the duel, he says that it's inevitable So you might as well do it the right way. So his book is sort of a guide on how you do the right kind of duel. And there's a bit of an echo of it in a case from 1611. There was a duel between Fra Henri de Lancry de Benne. He was a French knight, and he was also the nephew of the Grand Master, of the Wignacourt. And he had a duel with Fra Francesco dell'Antella, who was the Italian secretary to the Grand Master. Now, de Benne was younger than dell'Antella, and de Benne accused dell'Antella that he was poisoning his uncle's mind, the Grand Master, against him. Dell'Antella, as the older man, tried to back off. But de Benne kept coming at him, and eventually a duel was inevitable. In the process, dell'Antella kills de Benne. So the young knight, the nephew of the Grand Master, is killed. Dell'Antella goes to the Grand Master, tells him what has happened, and offers to basically, as it were, punish himself by going into exile, as the honorable thing to do. The Grand Master, bound by these codes of honor, tells dell'Antella that no, he doesn't have to go into exile. He understood that it was his nephew that had wronged, that had been on the wrong side, and actually rewards dell'Antella by giving him a commandery, a piece of land. Because that was, in the way they understood things, the honorable path to be followed, since it was the nephew who had been wrong. So there are these wonderful contradictions in the way that society operates. Code of honor, the duel being illegal, and yet somehow still being bound by all of this sort of thinking that lies behind it. Finally, besides the duel, you have also other forms of violence. Again, it's often groups. They're drinking, they're eating, they're playing games of chance, and often all of these situations do lead to violent brawls. And I lost count of all the examples of these. It's not too different from a brawl that would happen today if there's been a bit too much drinking happening, no? So, and that really takes them away from the self-control they're meant to be exercising as men. And yet somehow it's part of a language that they understand. One day you might be on a galley risking your life for your comrade fighting Muslims. The next, you're in a tavern and maybe you both want the same prostitute and you end up having a fight about her. It all sounds contradictory, but then again, which one of us isn't full of contradictions? And that's just the nature of humanity then, just as in the past. So that was a quick overview of violence.
Okay, it's a fascinating subject. It could easily go into a whole discussion on its own.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I don't think we have any questions right now, except, Cross is saying that it's not fair. No one gave him land when he won a fight. Maybe we should have run the other guy through.
Yeah.
So, we've been at this for 2 hours.
I guess why we're running dry now.
Yeah, I guess so. So, I think we can wrap up soon. unless anyone has any questions they would like to throw out. And Professor, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fascinating talk. It's been great listening to you.
Thank you, Carl. So I just would end by saying that what I tried to show today, and I thank everyone for the questions, is that when we're looking at the past, now we're looking at people like us, faced often with very similar challenges, and who responded to them with the repertoire that they had, whether it's the theory of the humors, whether it's magic, whether it's the understanding of violence. And that is why the past is so fascinating, because we're not just talking of lists of kings and queens and lists of battles, but we're really talking about how people like us, women and men, try to meet the challenges of daily life. Sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. But ultimately, it's really about dealing with life and what life throws at you.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, let's see. Dungeon Matron says, I would like if Professor Buttigieg came back. This was great. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
And like
hopefully
we say,
the book is done, we'll come
yeah,
back.
absolutely. Please. Okay, Cross says it's enrapturing, Knights, Inquisitors, humors, magic tomatoes, prostitutes, duels. It was a roller coaster. Yeah, it was. And Charlene says, thank you, that was truly fascinating. Okay.
Thank you.
So, Doctor, thank you again so much for your time. And like I said, I will be posting the links to your references in the comments later.
Thank you.
So,
And
yeah.
again, if anyone is interested in the diploma, applications are open.
Oh, hi, Mom. Yeah, my mom said it was really interesting too.
Good.
So, thank you again, and thanks everyone for watching. I hope you have a great evening. Bye.
Goodbye.